out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. Just What's Wrong with England module. Take that as you will. It could be it will be socially. Party political broadcast on behalf of the Your Boys. The political arm of the department, I would say, is potentially being cracked open here, Dave.
The England agnostic wing of the Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating party.
And we are as well lending our authoritative kind of thumbs up to Count Binface as part of this as well. Whereas Keir Starmer was, even though he's kind of like, relinquishing his gig as we speak, I think, as we record this.
There's a bit of an alliance between the two, isn't it? Like, it's all rubbish one way or another, whether that's Binface or Starmer.
Has anyone seen Binface and Starmer in the same room together? That's the question. Will there be a grand reveal after the count in Clacton? That would be something. Binface takes off his helmet and there is it's Keir Starmer all along. It'd be like Scooby Doo
or Margaret Thatcher,
or Margaret Thatcher,
or Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, it could be anyone.
Jeremy Corbyn could be. Who is Count Binface? Our module today, inspired by England's defeat to Argentina. Really, a conversation broke out amongst the Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating in the staff room, basically, as everyone fought and got their elbows out for the teaspoons and the cups and all of that. Dave, we are totally ambivalent to the concept of England losing that World Cup semi-final. Massively ambivalent to the England national team since time immemorial in many respects and for many reasons as well. But we felt this needed doing because it was a fascinating concept. Why England can't win at most things, I think, in generally, when the chips are down.
Yeah, broadly speaking, we can't win at anything, can we? I find it a fascinating thing because I think Pete's far more qualified to talk about this, I think, than either of us. But I think it goes far more than what your 11 players or your 16 players on the pitch are, or who your coach is, or all of that kind of. I think it says something about England as a nation, not the United Kingdom or Great Britain or whatever. I think it's a very specific England thing, and there are lots of very specific England elements to why England fail in inverted commas. I mean, we'll talk about is semi-final a failure, I suppose, in more depth a bit later on. But I think there is an England mentality, an England attitude. It says something about the culture, about the politics, about the social nature of the country as well. And I think we've got plenty to explore in the next 5 or 6 hours.
That is a definite, because we have got Pete Watson on board as well. Pete, much to say, and time is not always our friend, but the floor is open, Pete.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those where you start, really. I think first of all, it's a pleasure to be on the show with you, as always. It's my first debut on this particular strand of the podcast. I'd like to build on what Dave was going about mentality, and I think what it's really important to do from an academic perspective, which is the branch of wisdom that allegedly I belong to more, as also a fairly impartial outsider in many ways to England football, as someone who trotted the globe as a kid and lived in Dubai and Colombia and Portugal, and I'm half Scottish, so identity is always a problem for me. But if we try and pin down where this mentality comes from, where culture comes from, I think what you're looking at is a kind of an agglomerated series of experiences, of identities and narratives and memories that all kind of are part of how we look towards what England is. Again, in any kind of terms, politically speaking, culturally speaking, socially speaking, but also in football, because they are different, And I think football memories and football narratives and what the mentality of what England is there does kind of nourish how we come to understand whenever England play again, and particularly in tournament. So if you think about, those kind of foundational memories of what English football is, what English mentality in football is, you have to look at things like it's our game, apparently. We created it. We spread it around the world. We are the fathers of world football. Now, unfortunately, that means that there are lots of sons and actually a lot of daughters as well, if we now kind of spread that out to women's football as well, which I think is a different thing anyway. So then you have this kind of what happens when our sons get better than us or start challenging us? How does that kind of relationship and mentality develop? Is there a sense of entitlement? Is there a kind of sense of arrogance? That's certainly there in the early days of we expect to be better than all you benighted children across the world who we have blessed with our great games, because it happens in rugby and cricket as well. Then you start to have the politeness or the way we play, the fair play aspect. Can we play tough? Can we play dirty? Can we cheat when it matters? Or do we have to try to be light? Is this kind of ethos part of what our mentality is? Is that preventative in any way? And then you have kind of lots of different memories, the kind of shock of 1950, the shock of Hungary. I would argue, and I'm going to write an article about this, about South America knew English football was already not very good, in 1950 and again when England tours in 1953. So then you have that kind of fragmenting of that kind of shield of, are we the best? Hang on, what happens if we're not the best? Then you kind of look to other periods of, failure and success. What does 1966 really mean? Is that, are we the best again or not? Is this just a home victory? What did that kind of goal that shouldn't have counted? And then you have all the kind of things like penalty failures. Can we win or lose when it really matters? And all of those singular experiences and memories then kind of add up to form what is our memory? What do we think English football is? And a lot of it is based on not winning, on not doing it really matters, on having doubts about how good we actually are or could be or really are. There are kind of shifting sands that kind of undermine a sense of, are we really good when it matters? So if those are all present in fandom, as fans, we know these things, we see it written in the press, on TV, on podcasts like this, on social media and so on. It does impact the players as well. So you kind of wonder about how those kind of, all those kind of layers of mentality that go through history and identity and memories all kind of add up to what players are thinking when it comes down to these crunch moments, and what do coaches think, and what do fans think in the stadium? And does that impact what, like some academics in a kind of more psychological field have called flow, the ability to find this kind of zone of perfect football, of flow, when confidence, when it all just kind of emerges in the best type of sport performance that you possibly can. And whether England can find that flow when it really matters is probably something that you'd say, well, has it ever happened? And if it did, when was it? Maybe it's the 5-1 versus Germany. Maybe it's that 4-1 against Netherlands in Euros. So I think all that's just a kind of starting point on where mentality comes from and what kind of affects it in a kind of fan's perspective, a player's perspective, and what a broader English football mentality might be.
Hey Dave, it's fascinating that everything that Pete goes through there. I mean, I'm sat listening intently what he's saying, but everything that I grew up on tended to be surrounded in English failure of things. Whether that's kind of like, politically throughout the 1980s, the us and them, environment engendered by Thatcher, on the back of the savage 70s, which was, full of like the winter of discontent, hung parliaments and chaos, all manner of 3-day weeks and everything that was involved throughout the 1970s. But then it's just in a purely sporting nature. I grew up on kind of like the English/British being pretty inept at tennis. It was quite a thing when Jeremy Bates made the 4th round at Wimbledon. I always knew that Roger Taylor was the last Brit to make it to the quarterfinals or semi-finals of Wimbledon, and that was kind of like shortly before I was born. How he managed to find time to do that and be a guitarist in Queen or whatever he was. But yeah, I can remember that in the 1980s, and everyone but England winning the 5 Nations was always kind of like a standout thing. England were occasionally decent at cricket. I remember the Botham Ashes test and how that swung around in 81 being my introduction to actually kind of this is actually quite interesting, this cricket sport. But I can remember kind of like the golf. It was always about Tom Watson and Jack Nicklaus winning. Bill Rogers was another one. British players simply didn't win the Open, and then Sandy Lyle did. And it would be kind of like quite the culture shock if a British/English team/individual did well within a sporting environment. There's an England side that don't qualify for World Cups throughout the 1970s. They don't qualify for the 1984 European Championships. The World Cups they do get to, they're not all that exciting. They don't capture the imagination. So I grew up on the concept of Englishness being kind of Charles Horsey, and Kenneth Williams, and it's end of the pier stuff, and it's summers can be lovely and all that type of stuff sometimes, but there was something just utterly, there was nothing more, I don't know, kind of emblematic of how I saw my surroundings of what I was growing up in wider terms, as kind of like things like Bless This House and George and Mildred. Now, this is the kind of like the UK I grew up on, apart from in our own little kind of like Scouse bubble where it was very, very different. Hey, Dave, the overlap between sporting, cultural, political, every day on the street, nature, it does all pull in together. It ties in together, and sport is just simply an amplification of the wider, I don't know, kind of psyche of the English.
You're right about the failures of the 70s, the 80s, and 90s. In general, in English sport, British sport as well to a degree, we're going through a golden period. I mean, we've never probably been as good at the Olympics, for instance, as we have been over the last, probably 20 years. We've had successful golfers at the top over some of that period. I think the lottery, the investment in sport via the lottery made a big difference to others. But football has always been apart from all of that, because the other games, although cricket has been wholly professional since the 60s when they got rid of the gentleman players thing, but cricket's a little bit different because it's such a comparatively small sport over such a condensed period of time. You have 3 months of the year. It used to be 3 months of the year. Whereas football is this all-encompassing thing, and crowds of 50, 60, 70,000 people. There was money in football. You could argue where it went, etc. So football was always a bit of an outlier in that. But again, in football, this is the golden period for English football at an international level. We've had 2 World Cup semi-finals, a European Championship final in the last 8 years. I mean, other than '66, which increasingly looks like the complete outlier from everything. This is as good as it's ever got for English football. Peter's mentioned this before and off air as well. Is getting to the semi-finals of the World Cup a failure? Well, really, it's not. I mean, that puts you in the best 4 teams in the world, which is not a bad achievement, is it? Really? And you've done it twice in 3 World Cups. That's quite a substantial achievement, really, in that sense. So, was Leeds' season a failure last year because they finished 14th? No, it wasn't. Was Brentford season a failure because they finished 10th? No, it wasn't. You have to have some perspective on what exactly constitutes success and failure. Yes, of course, you want to win, you want to carry off the prize, you want to have all that stuff. But you have to remember that there's 11 blokes kicking the other way, and sometimes those 11 blokes are better than you are. Sometimes they are better organised, or they've got a better coach, or they've got better players, or sometimes the luck will go their way, or a decision will go their way, or whatever. It's not just as simple as, well, we are England, we'll turn up and we'll win. And that's where all this coming home stuff drives me to distraction. What's supposedly coming home? We didn't even bother turning up to the World Cup for 20 years. So, we can hardly say that the World Cup's coming home if we bring, if England win it. The idea that, yes, England maybe is the one that propagated the game around the world, as Pete's already said, yes, that's got some relevance to it. But in terms of international competition, Scotland is the home of international football, because the first international game was played in Scotland. England were in it, but it was played in Scotland. It's this sort of English arrogance and English expectation, this has been, I suppose, the journey post-war, really, from the Churchillian bit about we stand alone against the world, and we did this and this. to the realisation that as the world has progressed over the last 80 years since then, we are, if we accepted that we were roughly as significant as Belgium, I think we'd be a much happier country in every possible way.
Hey, Pete, it's coming home. What does it even mean?
I mean, this is unfortunately where this entitlement arrives. Now, I think one of the problems is that it gets taken in two ways, doesn't it? In that I did see an article by a guy called Josh Bland, Dr. Josh Bland, very good academic, talking about the idea that it's not always an entitlement thing. There's an idea of longing or irony or the wish for better days to return, which kind of falls into what you were saying earlier, Steve, about the troubles and failures and just this desire for success. And it's not all based on a sense of entitlement. And there's a degree of irony and self-mockery or laughing at ourselves a little bit. I think the problem is that doesn't necessarily translate, and equally, that it's coming home does as well, rely to, we have the best league in the world, TM, copyright, we have the best footballers, we have our tradition, it's our game, we started it. The two things are present, there are no single answers here. There are lots of different ways in which things are taken. So I think that that's this problem of, it's coming home thing. And I think that often ties into or is seen to tie into by others. Because I think, you have the internal expectation of what it's coming home is, but also an external, and that is governed by all kinds of international relations. For example, the empire and colonialism. If this is our home, and everything has to come home, it's almost much like you took all your things home from our countries. If we go to Elgin Marbles or our football players who have to come home because that's where things are. So I think that's part of the problem in terms of how, certainly, for example, how Argentina might take the idea of it's coming home for how England might say that. So I think that there are kind of different layers there. And I think that, part of the problem that Dave kind of alluded to there is this kind of internalism, this kind of, a failure for a long time for England to accept outside influences and the fact that they could be better or we could learn from them. There's this kind of insularity. And maybe that links to our island, our little island, and Britain stands alone and Britain rules the waves and this is our empire. And I think it takes, for example, a very long time for, English football, and maybe British football to some extent as well, to accept that there are other very valid, better ways in which the game is played. And also, if those forms are being played, whether those are particularly legitimate, you have a lot of cheat, dirty play, individualistic. They have natural talent and flair, which kind of falls into these kind of exoticized ideas of the Brazilian, the Argentinian, the Uruguayan, or whatever else it might be. And I wonder whether Britain is prepared to allow, or was for a long time, England prepared to allow those different elements into our sport, into what our sport is, because there's such a kind of precious hold on what British sport is or English sport is and how it should be played. I think one of the things that Dave said is that we are in a golden age of success, and success is relative. Only one team really succeeds at the World Cup. 200 odd nations fail. And I'm sure that there are podcasts in every single one of the countries that were in the World Cup and weren't in the World Cup. They're probably having a podcast exactly like this. And I can tell you a lot about them, but that's probably another podcast about what debates are being had. So you have to kind of look at and say, right, what has changed? There are lots more professionalized elements. There's a lot more acceptance of outside ideas of nourishing those kind of games. Yes, England isn't quite taking that final step towards that final moment. But there is at least a much more accepting idea of what elements can improve our game. I think another aspect is the professionalization, the kind of amateur ideal of this is the way that should be played. We play for fun. It's fair play. It's good sportsmanship. We don't kind of analyze all the single elements that make up success, from psychology, from technology, from, he hates to say it, spying, from tactical appraisal, from looking at player diets, from looking at player mentalities, from looking at all of those things. We now live in a very technical, tactical, professionalized era that England does embrace a lot more. But a lot of those things don't necessarily come from the English game. Probably the only innovators, if we look at sports and Britain as being incredibly professional, it's probably cycling with everything that, what was his name? I've forgotten the guy's name that was the coach. It was the Ineos kind of team, but Dave Brailsford, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So I think all of those kind of things that are filtering in terms of, problems to do with what it's coming home is, but now how that's starting to kind of shift beyond that to a more acceptance of learning. I don't know if all that makes sense or if that's all tied together.
No, it makes sense. It is. I think you're right there that it is tied together. One can't go hand in hand without the other, Dave. You say Pete's got salient points there about the cycling. I can't remember which one of you meant. I think it was you, Dave, mentioned, the improvements in the Olympics. I mean, I can remember like 96 in Atlanta, and I think Britain came away with one gold medal, and that was Redgrave. And to go from that to what they did at kind of like London 2012, and then to maintain a compatibility. Where I turned around and said that, the UK-England was a particularly accident waiting to happen, something of a laughing stock throughout the 70s and 80s that I grew up becoming familiar for them to be. We have members of the Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating collective that have a very different view on that because they've grown up during an era of achievement at sporting levels. Suddenly, I mean, a lot of people have been posting things on Twitter and Blue Sky, etc., over kind of like how England did in their first 4 or 5 major international tournaments. For a lot of us, we're citing failure to qualify, failure to get out of the group stages, maybe a quarter-final defeat here and there. Whereas a lot of people are suddenly saying, well, my first 4 tournaments cite a semi-final, a beaten final, a quarter-final, a beaten final, a beaten semi-finals. Suddenly, moving beyond our generation, there will be a completely different outlook to this.
Absolutely, there will. As I said, this is the golden age. As we speak, our podcast about the golden generation has literally gone out this morning, and I think that one is a really interesting sort of fault line. I think it's one of the things that's changed a lot about English football, but particularly about England in general since 1966. You inevitably have to go back to 1966, and England, Britain in the 60s was still a collective country. It's still got the war memory. Everybody banded together to fight the war, etc., etc. We'd founded the NHS. Trade unions were changing things, etc. The great gift of Alf Ramsey to English football was not winning the World Cup. It was the collective. It was that the team was what mattered, and it wasn't about having a great individual player. It was about what the team did, and here we are. We're a couple of days out from the World Cup final, but it seems that there's every chance that Spain will win the World Cup with the collective. Spain is the team, isn't it? It's about the team. Yes, they've got fine individual players, of course they have, but they're about the team. And it just feels as though England as a nation, we were about that collective, and yes, the collective thing with the unions, there was a 3-day week and all of that stuff. And that's because we had an intransigent Conservative Party for the coal miners, etc. Let's put that in there. But it then moved away from that, didn't it? And it stopped being about the collective, and it was, the cult of the individual. And we, even though we joined it was the EEC then, wasn't it, in 1973 under Ted Heath? That was the start of us looking away from Europe again and looking towards America. And then when Thatcher won in 79 and the relationship with Reagan and all of that, we've since then we've tied ourselves increasingly to America and to American ideas and ideals, and it is about the individual. It's about individualism. It's about the lone gunman walking into the town in the West. It's Clint Eastwood and John Wayne and all that, and cleaning everything up and that sort of stuff. And we look to individuals. We've Ian Botham, for instance, in the 80s. We looked. It was Gary Lineker. It was Paul Gascoigne that were going to win it for us. It was Frank Lampard and Steven Gerrard were going to win it for us. Now it's Bellingham and Kane that are going to win it for us. And it's not, we don't stress the importance of the team enough, I don't think. Certainly not within football. It's always looking at the individual. And that's because, in part, we've become this madly obsessed celebrity culture. which we weren't in the 50s into the 60s. We weren't about celebrity culture at all. Now, probably, I suppose, the arrival of the Beatles and the Stones and whatnot in the 60s, and David Bailey and all of that, Michael Caine, began to move that away as well. But we are about celebrity. We are about tittle tattle. We are about individuals. We're not about going forward as a group. We're always looking for the Messiah. We're looking for Boris Johnson or Nigel Farage. God help us in politics. We don't think about doing the hard yards, do we? We don't. As a country, we don't want to do the hard work at foundation level that nobody pays any attention to. But if you haven't done that, you don't get the rewards at the other end. As soon as anything goes wrong in this country, no, we stop. We've got to do something else. We'll change tack. And that's what has worked in this country in the last 50 years. Never mind sport as a country. What's worked in this country in the last 50 years? How many big infrastructure projects have we delivered and delivered successfully? I don't know. The Channel Tunnel, which was a partnership with the French. What have we done in this country in the last 50 years that's been successful? I struggle to think of anything particularly. So in that milieu, it's no wonder that the football team or the cricket team isn't particularly successful. And I think as well, and this is a very old fart concept, but discipline has changed. The use of discipline has changed. Go back to the Ashes in the winter, the first test. England had been blown out by Australia in the first innings, but they then recovered. And at lunch on the second day, they were about 105 ahead, I think it was, on a terrible pitch with only one wicket down. You cannot lose the test match from there. They managed to lose it on the same day. Now, that's not just about technique and ability. That's about, again, mentality. It's about doing the hard yards. It's about digging in. It's about not being spectacular. It's about doing the boring stuff a lot of the time. And doing the boring stuff is what leads to success most of the time in whatever field you're in. And I think we have become allergic to doing the boring stuff. We used to be, it was a stiff upper lip and it was a staid British way and all of that. And that's all gone. And, for good in lots of respects. But it's also come at a cost in other respects. And you've got to be willing to do those hard yards at times. You've got to be willing to get your head down and do the dull stuff. Even when people are criticising you for being dull, you've got to be willing to do it, and then you'll come out the other side of it. But no, we look for a bit of crash bang wallop, and that'll resolve it. And occasionally it works, and very often it doesn't.
I mean, Pete, Dave comes up with the concept of the need for a hero. The need for someone, hark back to the 1980s again, but that's got Brian Robson and the England national team stamped all over it for me. This concept that there simply has to be some kind of version of Superman or Supergirl who's going to run into the telephone box to get their underpants over the top of the trousers and save the day. This is a bewildering concept. I mean, I mentioned to Dave yesterday that Liverpool as a city is very, very different, and it swims in the opposite direction. If there is a negative tide, it will swim against that tide, simply out of A, bloody-mindedness, but B, you're looking at it and saying that doesn't make sense. So, within that, the collective remains everything rather than the individual. And that's what I grew up on, though. So in terms of my family unit and the bubble that I grew up in, we really were the boy in the bubble, in so many terms, and remain so, I think, sometimes. But this concept of the need for a hero, for someone to step up and take responsibility within this, but the responsibility of the collective is quite damning.
Yeah, I think it's important to see where those narratives are coming from. I think the need for hero is a press narrative. It's a media narrative. It's not a new one. I don't think it's a very British one either. I think that this idea of the star, the icon, the hero is projected, everywhere, and it goes back a long, long way. There is a media need to sell, and the hero, the iconic figure, the emblematic symbol figure is kind of there, whichever kind of team you want to talk about, and then you attach various meanings to it. So I think the media definitely has this kind of need to create hero narrative around certain players, and I think then then you have the problem of what those heroes are and what they can really do and how good they really are, and maybe what if you look at kind of how impactful they actually are. I mean, I'm like you. I'm slightly younger than you, I think, Steve. But I remember watching that '80s side. I always think that English football in the '80s, at an international level, was, and even a player skill level was pretty dire. I remember thinking Brian Robson and thinking, yeah, he runs around a lot, probably works quite hard. So what? I'd like to see guys that can dribble, that have skills, that can beat people. I don't want to see. Running is what you should do. In lots of ways. And I think that, if you come back to how influential is that hero and what do they actually really do? How impactful really are they? And actually, what is their heroic status really based on in terms of tangible success and game-winning potential? That's kind of where it's really at. So if you look at someone like, if you come to, the icon of Argentina, because Argentina do have a collective, but they also have a star within that, an icon within that. But everything kind of works because the icon is is very much part of that, the collective, the kind of fulcrum. He's the kind of fulcrum who directs it, which is a slightly different thing, but it still is a collective. But equally, there is generally an impact. And for a long of the time, the problem with Messi was that he hadn't had that impact when it really mattered. That was always the problem with him. So I think that's one thing. The second thing I think is that I bet any money that this kind of idea of the hero narrative is not one that is constructed from in the team itself. I can't imagine Tuchel was saying, we need one of you to stand up. It is going to be a collective narrative. So then it comes down to, can these players fight, struggle when it really, really matters? This England team, got to the last four and did it when it really mattered against Mexico, against the Congo. Did they play well? Maybe not. But you don't get points for playing well. This is another England expression where everything has to be perfect. It can't possibly be, a fighting win is fine, but we didn't play well, but we didn't play engaging football. It doesn't actually matter. But there is an obsession with this, an obsession to criticize, a flaw, a slight problem, a slight issue. Let's magnify it. Let's discuss it. I think the narrative of the collective will definitely exist within all the teams. Tuchel, Southgate, will always be talking about the collective. Against Argentina anyway, they met, a team who everyone can see it mattered, and again, it's does it matter more? It doesn't probably feel like it should matter more because every single person on that pitch wanted to win for themselves, for their country, for their mates. In terms of Argentina, you have such a kind of cultural weight of nation desperate to win, an absolute desperation to win, a fighting spirit, a kind of recent narratives of success that give them that flow and give them that sense of potential achievement of, we have to fight to beat these English because it kind of matters so much. It almost felt like that was more. Whether that is or not is actually debatable because all of those other little problems like tactics and, the individual quality of the players also comes in. So, it's a problem with what narratives kind of exist. And then you have, because we're all trying to make sense of the circumstances on the pitch. So I think, I kind of often, worry about to what extent do we add extra narratives that are just the convenient story to help explain they played a bit better than us or someone got their header on target, rather than, the bloke missed it when it really mattered. I think discipline is another really interesting one. It's something that comes up a lot in education, as well, in terms of how hard do students work? Is AI reducing it? Does discipline reduce the ability for students to work hard? Do they really care themselves? I see a lot of students who work incredibly hard, who really care really hard. Discipline, I'm sure, was apparently a lot better in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. I didn't see England winning very many things then, when it was a lot easier to do so, when there were a lot less countries playing at a lot less of a professional, high standard level at that time. It should have been a lot easier for England to win things then. They might have had the odd good series in the Ashes. The football team wasn't winning very much. So it's a kind of a weird one, because I think we always look for the kind of little percentages and wonder where it is. And how it affects things. So I'm kind of wandering around and kind of never really pointing out stuff. But I think you've got to bear in mind all those issues that are part of what we're trying to pin down in terms of discipline, ability, collectives, heroes, wanting it. It's all quite quite nebulous. It's quite incidental in terms of what facts are going and what the other team are doing as well.
And Dave, the chemistry of it, I always find fascinating. This current generation of England players are clearly doing a lot better than many of in the past. To be able to reach 2 World Cup semi-finals in the last 8 years, 2 European Championship finals. That in itself is a hell of a leap from where they were in. If England get past the quarter-final, that was remarkable. That whole concept of it, how long does an ingrained kind of ethos last in some respects? Pete talking there about wanting it more and that type of thing. Passion is a massive driver in achieving anything. And it's clearly a big thing in sport. And as a Liverpool supporter, I see Liverpool do things that I don't see any other English club do in terms of how they can dig themselves out of a situation or drive themselves on to win something. And that old mantra of "we're not English, we are Scouse." Yes, it's a pantomime. It's a pantomime line, really, but there is a little bit of truth in there. Is that as a city that looks out to the sea rather than inland, it does things somewhat differently. I was looking at some of the celebrations on the streets in Buenos Aires, and the bizarre the thing that first popped into mind when I saw kind of like the passion in the support and the pyros and the streets brought to a standstill was that once upon a time I was looking at stuff like that and the way that Liverpool fans were doing it, post 2019 Champions League final, etc., throughout the Klopp years. And just how South American Liverpool was suddenly looking in times of celebration. I was looking at the celebrations of Buenos Aires thinking it looks very much like Liverpool. And it's the strangest thing that just how ingrained does that stiff upper lip concept of, how long does it filter, how long to it until it filters out in some respects? Because I am looking at kind of like what Argentina did and thinking, well, I just couldn't see an England side doing that and having that, kind of part anger, part passion, part, just that inexorable will that I am not going to be denied my target here. I've set my stall out and we are going to win this.
It's an interesting thing because one of the reasons why English clubs were always so feared in the European Cup / Champions League was, lots and lots of teams that were beaten by English sides. English teams never know when they're beaten, and that which doesn't seem to translate to the national team. Yes, Liverpool were always like that. Manchester United famously were exactly the same under Ferguson. How many goals did they score in Fergie time? Obviously, the Bayern Munich game is the obvious one, but I mean, week after week after week at home, they would be winning games in the last 5 minutes, turning games around. So I mean, it's not wholly alien to us as a nation. I mean, that was kind of one of the great strengths of English club football, although, of course, English club football has always had enormous numbers of foreigners in it, whether those foreigners used to be Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, or now they come from France and Germany and Spain or wherever. It doesn't, as you say, it doesn't seem to translate to the national side. I do feel sorry for the national team because, I mean, again, as Pete says, winning's not enough. You've got to win the right way, and you've got to win by, bamboozling everybody and scoring 8 goals and being, thrilling and fantastic. And that's us as football fans all over, isn't it? You'll listen to the phone-ins and they'll say, well, as long as the lads put a shift in, we'll always support them. That's not true, is it? The lads can put a shift in and you lose 3-0 and they'll get dog's abuse as they come off. And then it's, what we want is to be entertained. And you can be entertained and lose 4-3. Do that 3 weeks in a row and they want the manager wrong. What we want is we want to win. We want to be entertained and we want to win like prime Barcelona every week in every game. And that's not a realistic aim either because it just doesn't happen. I think, the point about the press is absolutely right. I think we are overpraised when we win and we're over-criticised when we lose. They beat Mexico. Well, okay, that's not to denigrate winning in the Azteca Stadium and all of the history and all of that and down to 10 men. But all of a sudden, England are going to win the World Cup. And it was the same after beating Croatia in the group. Oh, this is a fantastic England side. Nobody can possibly stop them. And then, you play against Norway and you squeak through. what a terrible display from England, and they're no good at all. And then, obviously, we go from England coach Thomas Tuchel to the German Thomas Tuchel has now taken in that then is the immediate change in the focus. So I think the press narratives are very corrosive for England and have been for a very, very long time. Obviously we've done all those podcasts about assorted England World Cups, 1990 in particular. There'll be one coming about Graham Taylor's era and all that sort of stuff. I think that the press has done England no favours in that sense from both angles, from both building them up too much and knocking them down too quickly. So I think there's all kinds of elements. I think England perhaps somebody was, I can't remember, I was reading the BBC, I think yesterday, and one writer was saying that the English press are probably more ferocious in that sense than anywhere else. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I mean, they certainly are pretty ferocious when it comes to the England circulation, and now it's about clicks and all this, that, and the other. You go back 6-8 weeks before the World Cup, and Jude Bellingham was a terrible problem for England, and was his off the field activities stopping him being a great player. Now, he's God all of a sudden. Well, neither of these two things are true, but coping with that must be very, very difficult. And I do think, the point that Tuchel made when he first came in about Southgate's England being more about not losing than going on and winning and having the guts to go and win is probably true, because the level of stick that you get for losing probably feels worse than the high that you get from the praise from winning. And I think that's an element of within English football. And I think that takes a lot of getting rid of, and it takes characters to get rid of that. And I'm not sure that we've necessarily got those characters. And just to finish on the insularity thing, I think most people would say that the two best players for England were Kane and Bellingham, who have been playing in European football for several years. And I think us as a country, our English footballers, and you can understand why, because you get paid enormous quantities of money in the Premier League. You can understand why you would want to go abroad. But I think if you went abroad and were exposed to different problems on the pitch, different ways of preparing, different ways of thinking, and just a different way of life, I think it would expand their horizons as footballers.
Pete, well, of course, push comes to shove here. Clearly, England as a nation in particular, but across the UK as well. A lot of people want many, many different things. Is it a nation that is going to be incapable of pushing in the same direction collectively?
No. I mean, in terms of politically, yes, completely. No nation, I don't think any nation is capable now of pulling the same way because of how polarising, the media and politics is. In football, it will just take, one team to find a way to win. And, it might happen. It happens in other sports. The England rugby team for a long time, weren't winning the World Cup, then managed to do it. Suddenly everything changes. It depends on, the perfect combination of factors coming together to achieve that. There are players that can do it, and I think as Dave has already said, as we've said, this is a much better golden generation. We have lots of things going the right way in terms of different styles of play, different types of players, different types of backgrounds that are certainly improving. The game that England can put out, at particular times in particular occasions. So I don't think it's suddenly impossible. Spain had won the World Cup until they managed to do it. They probably would have had the same questions. Is the Furia Roja enough? Was suddenly the taka-taka, the tiki-taka style actually the defining moment to add to the Furia Roja style that changed everything? Or was it just they had lots of good players who happened to win at that particular time? Because tiki-taka then didn't work, in subsequent World Cups or whatever. I think it's so interesting, isn't it? Because I think if you look at, for example, going back to something that Dave was saying about the kind of narratives and national things about passions and rivalries. If you look at, for example, there is another England-Argentina game going on this weekend. I'm not sure that many people know about it. England are playing Argentina in rugby in Argentina. There are nowhere near the same amount of narratives or press discussions or things that, for example, Argentina can look for. Argentina doesn't have a history, for example, of going back to tons and tons of massive moments against English clubs or the English national team in rugby that's successful that will nourish that narrative. Rugby isn't connected to national identity like football is. There isn't a Maradona figure, there isn't a Ratin figure, there isn't. And again, one of the things that irritated me, as a Latin American historian, and somebody wasn't asked to commentate on any of these kind of issues in anywhere in the press, but it's like, well, where did you think 1966 came from? It wasn't suddenly, that was the event and Alf Ramsey called them animals and Ratin was really angry. There were lots of other things going on before that nourished that, which no one really talked about. In rugby, it doesn't exist. So you have a whole different set of circumstances that are culturally ingrained, memories, practices, media narratives, the heroes and all these kind of things. So what are those English rugby players, or what are those Argentinian rugby players looking back to? Because it is, they can tie into certain things at certain moments. I'll be very interested to see, for example, if probably Henry Pollock, who's already been like shushing Argentinian fans out the window of his Argentina hotel, whether, Henry Pollock is going to score a try on Saturday and then lift up a shirt and say the Falklands are English. And what will happen if he was to do that? Will that be as acceptable as what, the Argentinian players did at the end of the football game? Anyway, I'm kind of like varying across lots of points because what a lot of the things that Dave said I wanted to kind of add to as well. But can we get back together? Yeah, because certain generations, certain clubs, certain ways in which a culture within the team can be created will always happen. Every team who wins in the league, every single one, didn't know when they were beaten. It doesn't matter if it's Liverpool or Man United or Leicester. For whatever reason, that particular side didn't know when they were beaten because they ended up winning. And that's the same in every World Cup and European Cup, and that's a narrative you can put on them. That can be created between, in any kind of team culture, whether it's in a kind of minor cricket league, football league, amateur league, that can be created. It's whether, the particular culture around that, the coach, the players, the people within that, the identities, the resilience and mentalities within that can do that. And whether they get a bit of luck at the right moments or whether the fans get particularly by them or whether they make a right decision. All of those kind of things can come together. It's quite easy to put a particular limiting narrative on that's, it's just a Liverpool thing or it's just a Manchester thing or it's just a Glasgow thing, because actually it's not. It's a Montevideo thing. It's a Bogota thing. It's a Argentina thing. It's a, it just depends on what happens to some extent at the same time. I think that the key is, in terms of trying to win, is identifying all those ways, all those little things that compose success. And what I think you can question is to what extent in a very, very professional world that which we live in, sporting wise now, where everything can be controlled. And that's the great fault of the English cricket team. They forgot that, is that there is 100 odd years of cricket and there's analysis and there are different things that really matter. And England went on vibes to a large extent. And that's why England fell apart so much. So I think that's the key thing is that do you have a system, an environment, a culture, a coach, players that will buy into that can pinpoint all those things? And are you then just going to be doing that better than every single other country who have very, very similar setups, very, very similar attitudes, very, very similarly good players? And then who wins out then? That's where, that X factor, that weird moment does come in.
Dave, the concept of, this is an England football national team generation that it's all about taking that final step, basically, and which is often deemed the biggest step. I don't know, but even so, a German in charge of the England national football team. England cricket are considering employing an Australian to be at the helm of the cricket team. There was an Australian at the helm of the rugby union national team not all that long ago. That in itself strikes as a kind of a lazy option in many ways. Which nations are successful in achieving that big final step in obtaining success at something? Let's go and employ someone from there. Is that in itself? A, is it the answer, and B, is it a lazy option? Because within that, English football players can't be German, English cricketers can't be Australian, English rugby players can't be Australian. They can take something from, so they're learning from these people, these coaches. But at the end of the day, they still have to put their own spin, their own ingrained DNA spin on a bid for sporting success.
I'm not entirely with all the criticism that Tuchel has got over the last 48 hours for the game. But I don't think he should ever have been the England manager, not because he's a German, but because we started this whole St George's Park project 15 years ago or whatever it was, with the idea that we would have an English DNA, we would produce coaches, we would do all of that kind of stuff. And then we would have the way that other countries had done it to bring forward coaches for the national team. And, it worked to a pretty large extent with Gareth Southgate. There was a lot of doubt about Southgate when he first got the England job, and he went on to do a pretty strong job with it. As you say, 2 finals, a semi-final. That's that makes him right up there at the best. So I think again you've got to do the hard yards with it, and you've got to try and bring through your coaches. You've got to try and bring through your method. That was we spent a fortune on St George's Park. That was the point of it, wasn't it? That was going to be. This is English football. This is what we do. This is how we are. This is how we perform. This is what we expect from our footballers. This is what we expect from our coaches. And the first sort of opportunity, we then decided, well, actually, no, we'll get somebody who's won the European Cup instead. Well, that's nice, but where was the point of St George's Park in that case? Let's say that Tuchel's fed up with reading the papers over the weekend, and on Monday he hands his notice in. What are we going to do? We're going to go and get Luis Enrique next, are we? Or are we going to get Lee Carsley? I mean, is there a plan? Is there a plan? Genuinely, is there a plan? I don't think there is there? And the point of St George's Park was there was supposed to be a plan, because we've never had one in the past. Let's have one. Let's have this idea of what English football is. So, I think we've successfully got ourselves back into a mess that we were trying to dig ourselves out of for the previous 10 years. I think, some of the stuff that Tuchel has said is interesting about how England stopped the repetition of the passages of play that he was looking for. Of course, the players have all said that it was the manager's fault for getting them to drop too deep. Now, having interviewed footballers for 30-odd years, I know for a fact that they will blame anybody for anything except themselves. So, you can take whatever they say about what happened on the pitch with a pinch of salt. And all the former players I've spoken to have admitted the fact that, it wasn't always them. It was very rarely the manager. It was us. We didn't do what we were told, or we whatever. So, I think, again, you have to take a pinch of salt to the criticism that the manager is getting at this point. It's a relatively youngish team that England have got. I mean, Harry Kane obviously he's getting on a bit, but there are a lot of players there who will get better. You would imagine. Jude Bellingham he's going to get better, isn't he? You would think. What is he? 23, 24. He's got a couple of World Cups left in him. He's playing at a high level at Real Madrid, etc., etc. Those players, presumably, a lot of them will be better for the experience that they've had now. I think I always felt it was going to be very difficult for England to win this particular World Cup just because of where they were playing, the climate and the heat and all of that stuff. I think England have got a pretty decent chance in the next Euros in 2 years' time of coming through and actually winning something. And we'll see how that goes. But you've got to be careful again of the stuff we were talking about before about overreacting one way or the other. You're either the best thing since sliced bread or you're the worst team that's ever played on the pitch. England did pretty well. They will finish 3rd or 4th in the world. That's not a bad place to be. If somebody wins a bronze medal in the 400 metres at the next Olympics, we'll say, wow, well done, great work. You've done a fantastic job there. England might be picking up bronze medals. By the time you hear this, England might be walking away as the 3rd best team in the world, 4th best team in the world. Doesn't really matter, does it? I think that by and large, we've seen a good direction of travel, haven't we, over the last 10 years. Now, whether they can continue that direction of travel is another thing. Whether we do find that it gets distorted back into another golden generation and all the circus that goes around that, or whether they can just get on with their job and be footballers. We'll wait and see. But again, as Peter said, so much of this is not just about how good you are, how well prepared you are. it's about getting a bit of luck at the right time. I mean, the Jeff Hurst goal. Other linesmen would not have said that had gone over the line. England might have ended up losing that game. England, had home the benefit of being at home in 1966, when home advantage really was a thing, far more than it is now. You get the right, you get a bit of luck with injury. If Declan Rice hadn't spent 3 days in bed with, whatever illness, maybe England would have gone a bit better. If Gordon Banks hadn't been poisoned by the CIA in 1970, then perhaps England would have won that World Cup as well. It's there are, however much you want to, see it as this is destiny and that this team is better than everybody else. It does come down to those fine margins that all coaches and players talk about, and sometimes they fall your way, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes there's a better team waiting for you. In the if you're talking about 200 teams who play the game in the World Cup, there's a fair chance that amongst all of them, one of them's going to be better than you are. So it's not it's not a complete disaster. It's not a disgrace, is it? It's just the nature of sport. Sometimes somebody's a bit better than you are.
Pete, Dave's alluding, he's set out the ingredients that England have at their disposal to be able to garner success. Yet they do continue to fall short in the most kind of like stunning consistency in that respect. Looking at some of the messages that went through on the Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating WhatsApp group. Chris Lepkowski, I'm not one for stats, but I've just seen a mad bit of data that suggests England completed 2 accurate passes in the 20 minutes before Argentina equalised. Those 2 passes both came from Pickford to Stones. There is a kind of a fear factor that grips the English at times in moments of potential. I'd look at, say, tennis. You've got Andy Murray there, and we can all kind of like turn around and say 2-time Wimbledon champion, a US Open champion, and that in itself, that's utterly amazing. Yet, as a very talented tennis player, he played in an era in which there was a Federer, a Nadal, and a Djokovic, and he wasn't. He could mix it with those, but you look at the numbers that they clocked up over their Grand Slam careers. Andy Murray had enough talent to have at least made that a shorter gap of being the 4th best player of that era. He had all the talent and ability there. You've got Aidan Williams. There's also an element of Platini's old comment: the English are lions in the winter and lambs in the spring. This Aidan also mentions about how he's kind of like the outcome of the game on Wednesday night. It's like he'd watched it over and over again. It was like watching an old repeat off the TV. It is startling just how repetitive the manner of failure, not failure, but shortcoming, shall I say? Because we've already said, where is that glass ceiling? What do we define as success and failure? But if we say the shortcomings in terms of actually getting the hands on a trophy for this particular bit, those kind of like shortfallings are very repetitive.
Yeah, I think what we're looking at is what happens when it really counts in terms of pressure, and how do teams and players respond to those real pressure moments. If you look at one of the things that we could also go back to with, the kind of, again, I don't want to use collapse, but, not succeeding when it really, really matters, when the pressure's on. We can look at, penalties, for example, the terrible failures of Waddle, of Batty, and all the other people who unfortunately missed the penalty when the pressure was on, who couldn't, for whatever reason, do it really, really mattered. And I think that there a lot could be said about when the pressure was on, when the enormity of the achievement was there, what happened at that point. Yes, Tuchel made changes that had lots of problems. But what also happened was that the players stopped performing at the level that they could perform in that last 25 minutes, half an hour, whatever it was. Passing is just one aspect. Someone being able to control the game passing. Now, maybe the tactics didn't help that happen, but there were still 11 players on the pitch who could play better, find a way to control the ball, stamp an authority upon the game. There's one comment, again, it's from a Uruguayan colleague, who pointed out that, and I'm trying to remember which one it is, I think it's 1950, one of the Uruguayan captains, I want to say it was Obdulio Varela, stops, they concede a goal. He goes back, he gets the ball, he goes to talk to the referee, he stops everything. He just can't, just calms everything down, wastes time or whatever. But, he kind of took that on himself to stop and say, right, let's recompose, give our time to think, get our heads attuned to what we're trying to achieve. You could say that in those last minutes, and this is probably a common thing, is that when the pressure is on, when another team is attacking you, one thing that a lot of British sides don't do is suddenly wrest that control back and say, no, all we have to do is get the ball back and then pass it and then keep it and then pass it and then move and do those things. In lots of ways, that particular England team, against Argentina probably stopped and just held deep, didn't move forward. And that happens quite a lot. So I guess, to what extent is that, if what Platini said, if what happened with the penalties, can we keep the ball when it matters? Because ball possession is something that British teams historically, English teams particularly historically don't do. It's boot the ball out, it's kick it long. Are those some of the ingrained tendencies that don't enable us to fire at that particular moment? And those are the key moments. In lots of ways, the England cricket team, we go back to that. If you think about all those moments where panic sets in and, there is a kind of a collapse of wickets, it feels like a British phenomenon. A lot of other teams do it, but there seem to be more players for Australia, for example, that find a way to dig in that moment, not necessarily counterattack, but counterattack to some extent. And I think that, again, going to the Bazball era of cricket, what they took counterattacking to me was just to go bonkers, to absolutely flay it around. And sometimes you get lucky and sometimes you don't. And that led to a few spectacular moments, but some really bad ones as well. What you're really looking for is the brain to engage, is the skills, the practice, those years of passing the ball, of controlling the ball, of getting stuck in, of people regaining an issue, prepared to compete at that moment. So I think that, that is potentially something that is a narrative, a memory, a history, a tendency of going back to very simple basics of just get the ball away, just try and repel it in some kind of way. We'll hold the gates and we'll try and hold it as long as possible. And that's the kind of Dunkirk spirit. That's the charge of the Light Brigade. It's not necessarily engaging brain in response to pressure. So whether that's an ongoing issue, I think that's probably a worthy discussion. I think, one other thing I want to also bring up, because I think we haven't come to it. I think, since we've been chatting for one of the 5 hours that we're setting out to do, are you prepared to win dirty? England find it really hard to accept winning in a way that is not proper. Now, I'm a Southampton fan, although slightly lapsed. I live in Sheffield, quite a long way away. I don't watch Southampton very often, but everyone knows that Southampton have been pilloried to all posts because a bloke went to a camera to a training ground and watched the training session, and carried out James Bond level espionage activities that absolutely meant that we won, and Middlesbrough couldn't possibly play to anywhere near and win that game, because that's all it was. We've got a lot better at accepting that forwards are allowed to dive now and dive quite regularly. We're prepared to accept that when Harry Kane falls over or someone else falls over, that's now entered the British. We can accept that to a much greater extent now. Jostling and cheating and grabbing people at corners, is cheating, if we want to talk about it. So are England prepared to win dirty in all the other little ways that we were criticising Argentina for their despicable acts of provocation and nibbling at ankles and slightly late tackles and all those kind of things and winding up people? Is an English player prepared to run onto the pitch when we score a goal and cheer in the face of a few Argentine defenders like Valentin Barco did? Because, are we going to be, the shithouser, the shit stirrer? In ice hockey, it's the rat. There is the guy that will wind up and provoke the other team. It's a provocative discussion but that is very anathema to the British national identity. But so do you do that? Are English players prepared to go to that length of what football is and just say, look, it's up to the referee to stop it. That's what the referee is for. So let's do it until we can't get away from it. Is that part of what you do? So I think that's quite an interesting angle of saying to what type of winners do you want to be? What kind of winners is acceptable? And that kind of goes back to, does it just have to be the perfect performance showing grit and British bulldog and and magnanimity in our victories. What type of win are we actually capable of, and what will we accept? Is also part of the debate. I think being very provocative there.
Very, very provocative, but in a great way. Absolutely love it. Dave, Gary Lineker often turned around and said that what Diego Maradona did at the 1986 World Cup, he would definitely do. Yeah, from his teammates, there you've got Peter Shilton, Terry Butcher, Glenn Hoddle even, turning around and saying this is just completely unacceptable. Again, there's a cross-section of a collective that think very, very differently. That sense of British fair play, it's all very much man in a Panama hat, Alan Wicker. It's Marcus Brody in Indiana Jones getting lost around his own museum. There is those type of elements to it. Can we see? I suppose there were bits. Was it Garrett Jones did a bit during the 2005 Ashes? Is it Garrett Jones? I've got the name right. The wicket keeper who was given the sledging of he actually kind of like tied into the Australian way of doing things and trying to put the batsmen off and all that type of stuff. Do we need Jordan Pickford? I mean, to be fair, Jordan Pickford is quite the shithouse at times. So I can't say he's not tried. Does he need a few more of his teammates to kind of like follow his suit?
I don't believe for a minute that Terry Butcher would have gone and told the referee that Gary Lineker had punched it in with his hand in 1986. I mean, he might have said that afterwards, but no, I'm not having that. I mean, just before we come on to that, just the one thing that Pete was saying about the panic that sets in, and I agree entirely. But I find that really fascinating because that is something about national identity. Because all of those players in that team will have come through the academies, and they will all have been taught to play through the thirds and prize possession and pass the ball. All of that. That's what their entire education will have been in. People talk about the academies being too soft, etc., etc. But their education will have been keep the ball, play through the thirds, and then, as you say, when it gets into the heat of the moment, lump it 65 yards and hope something will happen. Now, where does that come from? Because they wouldn't have even grown up watching it on Match of the Day, because this lot of the generation that grew up watching the academy generation, this lot grew up watching the Steven Gerrard, Frank Lampard, Wayne Rooney generation. So it's interesting where that came from. I mean, in terms of being willing to win whatever way necessary. I mean, there is this English fair play thing and all of that. I'm not convinced by it as much now as I used to be. I don't think we are as committed to that as we were. And again, I think you can see that within the national discourse, if you like, within politics. It used to be a bit more gentlemanly, shall we say, in Parliament, and now it isn't. And now it's a slanging match, and it's all that sort of stuff. And we've discovered, as Trump has shown us, that all those things that were set up on the basis that we would all behave like gentlemen. Well, actually, if somebody decides they're not going to, it all collapses. And I think as a nation, we've become more willing to slag people off and say foul things to one another, which we would never have done 40 odd years ago, because it wasn't done. It wasn't a done thing. You never told people what you actually thought of them, because that wasn't good form. So I mean, I think as a nation that's changing, and I think it will probably change within football. Are we very good at it? Probably not. And I think we do want to be liked more than a lot of other nations. A lot of other nations couldn't care less what you think of them. They will go out and they will win the game. I think we have still got, I hate to say the Corinthian spirit, because we don't play with the Corinthian spirit, but we do still have that thing hanging over us that it's you have to win in the right manner. You have to win as a gentleman. You have to win as a I think that some of that is still around. I think it's ebbing away gradually, but I don't think we're very good at it. Basically, I think there is in the same sense that national folk memory of lumping the ball 75 yards is still there. I think that idea of the English gentleman doing the right thing is still there. And again, God knows why it should be, because these blokes are 23, 24, 25. I don't know where they're getting that cat. I mean, they didn't even grow up watching the black and white films that we grew up watching. They didn't even see any of that. They didn't, Charters and Caldecott and all that sort of stuff. They never saw any of that. Carruthers of the Foreign Office. That means nothing to them, but it's still somewhere deep in the folk memory somehow. And I think we're not. I think we're not very good.
Pete Tuchel himself has referenced English football's DNA as being one of the reasons why they've lost this World Cup semi-final. If we go full circle with that, and I asked Dave, how long would it take? How many generations are we looking at taking for that traditional English kind of, I don't know, rabbit in the headlights? We'll call it what you will. You've mentioned the penalty shootouts that England have repeatedly lost over and over again. How many generations do we look at before that type of DNA runs its course?
I think that essentially it just takes one moment of winning. And that moment then becomes more of a defining moment, a closer reference point that, the nation or its football team or football fans can then point to, which shifts your mentality. I think if you take the penalty shootouts, for so long, all we had was a memory and repeated narratives of the media, and pizza adverts of those penalties being missed. And that's what we could remember. And then eventually when that first, penalty win came in an important game in knockout football in international competitions, I think it might have been against Colombia, suddenly that changes. Suddenly that's a moment of, yes, we can actually do that. And that's where, newer generations, new players start to realise or can be narrated that something important has changed in a national mentality. So that can be used as a source of confidence. And this is then when we talk about belief, in terms of looking at tangible products, tangible moments that can infuse us with, a sense of belief. And I think that, a lot of nations, obviously struggle with that. If you look at Brazil at the moment, we're going back quite a long time to 2002 since their last World Cup win. So instead of the success of the 50s and 60s and, possibly even, the 70s to some extent as well, you have instead of that successful narrative where our style works and we have great players, a sense of doubt, of potential crisis, or at least national questioning that then starts to infuse a national conscience in terms of a footballing national identity. And if those questions persist, if they remain, if they become more and more embedded, then it's harder and harder potentially to get rid of that sense of failure as being inevitable or just forthcoming, and it's harder to imagine that success. But I think this is what all sports people thrive on. It's when that success does occur, and fighting for that first success does enable a series of other victories to occur. You find out how to win it. You've been there. You've experienced those moments and dug deep or found a way or thought of something that could work at those times. Again, if we look like a nation of Spain, though, for the generation at the moment, we'll think of Spain as a dominant force in world football. Now, that might have been the case, in the post-war club football with great Real Madrid teams, but it certainly wasn't the case in international football terms, where Spain for a long time were La Furia Roja and very little else. They were a team that ran hard and fought hard but never won anything. And then something changed, and then suddenly from that particular generation that wins their first international tournament, then they get the idea of how to do it and do it again. And I think this is what's going to be important for England, is that, as Dave said before, we do have a generation that is young, that has a potential of achieving something. And it's likely that if they build on what they've learned from this tournament and other tournaments and find a way to address the things that went slightly wrong, whether tactically or attitudinally or dealing with pressure or whatever it might be, or just coping with different types of opponents, if they can work on those particular details, then that's the way that success can be found. I think that's a really crucial aspect. So it just comes down to one moment. And if you look back on all of the football teams throughout the years that pin their identities on particular football moments, those are where success has occurred at some point. They become the defining moments. You always look back to those as a source of how can we get back to something like this, or can we at least remember what the key characteristics were, and can we improve on, add to it in lots of different ways.
I mean, Dave, you essentially were suggesting here that England have to unlearn everything about themselves that they've learned over the last 150 years. I mean, draw a parallel like contemporary Manchester City being this successful machine, but for them to be able to do that, they had to kind of unpick what Manchester City was all about, the typical City, version of Manchester City, and become a different version of themselves in that respect. Chelsea had to kind of under Abramovich, they had to stop being the Chelsea they were to some degrees to become this new Chelsea. England, Pete mentioned Spain earlier on, the perennial dark horses that you could back for doing typically English type of World Cup and European Championship campaigns. That was one of the big things. England will come up short. Spain will do exactly the same. But then Spain started winning things and they found the magic formula. But that magic formula went from being 2006 World Cup, where they infinitely did dark horse Spain things and went out of the World Cup, I think, in the last 16. First knockout round, I think it was. Maybe even the group stage. To winning it in 2008. That step, although it is billed as a chasm, it can be done in a short space of time.
It can be, and from an English perspective, it wasn't it, in 1966? There is nothing to fear except fear itself, as somebody once said, and that may be the problem with England. I think there is a lack of belief when it comes to those biggest moments, isn't there? That they don't continue to do what they've been doing, particularly in that Argentina game, and reliably England will beat all the teams that, in inverted commas, they should beat, and then we come up against the powers and fall short, and in part that's because they are better teams, and you're always liable to lose to better teams. But there's also, do you believe that you can beat that? I mean, it's like it used to be with Liverpool in the 70s and through into the 80s, and teams walked down that tunnel and they walked past the "This is Anfield" sign, and they'd already lost, and that continued until the point at which a couple of teams won there, and then all of a sudden it was, we've all got a little bit of a chance here. And I think that history has got a lot to do with it. It's very difficult to fight those, the pillars of history, if you like. It's to overcome that is tough, and as we've said before, the getting over the line thing as well is the trick. How often do you see teams that have absolutely run away with a division, and then they only need to win one more game out the last four, and they can't, and they struggle to get over the line. They fight, they either stumble over the line, or the other team loses and presents them with the title or whatever. So I think there's a lot of there's a lot of battling that weight of history, and until you have finally got through that, until you have finally got over the line, then it's a very difficult thing. And once you do get over the line, it becomes, oh, okay, we can do this. I mean, look at Jimmy White in the 80s in snooker. How many finals did he get to? 6, 7, and he didn't win one of them. Now that's not because Jimmy White was so much worse than Steve Davis or Stephen Hendry or whoever it was at the time. There was obviously an issue with Jimmy White when he got to the final. He didn't think that he was going to win because he'd lost a couple, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to a large extent. I suppose that was why they brought in somebody like Tuchel to try and change that mentality. I mean, that's asking a hell of a lot from somebody who sees his players, for what, 8 or 9 days, 3 times a season, and then for a little bit of time in the summer. To try and change that mindset is huge. But as you say, other countries have done it. Spain have done it, and then became serial winners. They won 3 tournaments in a row. Perhaps that's what England are on the brink of. Perhaps they are going to win the Euros in 28 and go and win the World Cup in 2030, and then the Euros again in 32. At this point, we don't know. They've certainly got the weapons to do it with. The players are there. What they need, what needs to happen here is exactly what hasn't happened over the last sort of 36 hours, where the players are blaming the manager and the manager's blaming the players, and that they're having a big infight. And what they should, what we need. Okay, I understand it's in the midst of the emotion of defeat and all of that. But what you need is to sit down calmly and say, well, what did we do well? Where did it go wrong? What went wrong? What can we do next time to make sure that it doesn't go wrong again? Whose fault was that? What should the coach? Does the coach take some blame? I should have done this, or do the players say, no, basically we bottled it and we dropped too deep too soon. You got to, as we've said before, you've got every possible analysis tool that there is now to go and look at that game, that last 25 minutes of that game, and learn what it was. And that that should be not just the fuel for going on and winning next time, but it should be the lesson. It should be the classroom, shouldn't it? Yeah. This is where it went wrong. This is what we didn't do. Maybe we couldn't have stopped that, but perhaps we should have done this bit differently. Right, next time we know. Next time we trust in this. We trust in what got us there. We trust in the patterns. We trust in this, rather than being another great national failure that it's been painted as over the last 36 hours. Maybe this is the launch pad for being, the start of an even better next 6-7 years.
I mean, Pete, this isn't just an English thing as well. Brazil, we've mentioned are massively struggling by Brazilian standards. They brought in Carlo Ancelotti. They've still gone out the first hurdle of the second stage of the knockout stages of this World Cup. We're looking at 28 years since 24 years since the last one, the World Cup. So it'll be 28 by the time the next one comes around. That's a bigger gap than between 1990 and 1994. And that's providing that they even win the next World Cup. Struggling on a more wider South American footing, compared to others. Italy, is it 3 World Cups now that they've failed to qualify for? Germany have lost in a penalty shootout at World Cup. Which is unthinkable. The concept of Jurgen Klopp taking over as Germany's manager, obviously piqued my interest to have a look at the players that he might deal with idly one day a few days ago. And what was quite noticeable was, yes, there are certain positions where there is an embarrassment of riches, yet a lot of positions, I'm looking at them and thinking there's a scarcity of huge talent there. So the concept of, I think it was you in the WhatsApp group mentioned the word elite. What constitutes now the world footballing elite at international levels? We would traditionally point to Germany, we would traditionally point to Brazil and Italy. Those 3 in particular being, the benchmarks for everyone else to live up to. As football's kind of borders have come down and players roll through, various nations at club level. That kind of, awareness, that interaction with all manner of coaching influences. We only have to look at Morocco, suddenly, arguably becoming one of the elite, or in danger of becoming one of the elite. A World Cup quarter-finalist this time around, semi-finalist 4 years ago. We don't know. They might be African nations champions, but they might not be African nations champions. That is still to be determined. But here, you have
Schrodinger's Morocco.
Exactly. France, currently kind of like everyone's kind of the hipsters' international team of choice, but have fallen short themselves on reaching the World Cup final. And going back to kind of like the 80s, the 90s, their failure to qualify for back-to-back World Cups. They didn't even reach Euro 88 to be able to defend what they had won so stylishly in 84. The Netherlands, who have achieved so much, yet also fallen short so many times, yet they aren't the Netherlands that we all grew up on. So that concept of identity, what is integrated, it's not just an English problem. It is becoming a more prevalent across the board problem in international football.
Yeah, it is. And I think that question of identity is very much at the heart of all of the debates that follow an exit from a major tournament. And it's probably worth, discussing some of them now briefly, and then we can probably categorize, the issues that emerge from these type of identity debates as well. So if you look at Brazil, for a starting point, there is a questioning of loss of identity. And that is seen to be through two different reasons. Firstly, you've got this idea that somehow evangelist Christianity is reducing that kind of Brazilian flamboyance and spirit and style and creativity that we very much made up the idea of jogo bonito. So now we don't have these kind of party free spirits, the malandro, the kind of sneaky guy who can always get out of something with a trick and a little bit of style and flair. Somehow they are they're talking about that this stricter form of religiosity is practiced by players or the society as a whole is actually impinging on a football identity and how it's practiced. And the second part of the debate is whether too many, for example, Brazilian footballers are going to something like the Premier League and their style is being lost, given this kind of tactical rigidity or the training that is taking place there. And again, someone like Cafu has talked about that. The problem with a discussion with that in terms of are Brazilians losing their identity because they're part of global leagues where that identity is being trained out of them is quite problematic when you look at someone like Argentina, who obviously their players are equally in similar numbers in a league like the Premier League and will go back and play for Argentina and seemingly automatically can connect with that type of style and identity and la nuestra with a little bit of aguante, of sticking at it, of bronca, of being able to mix it when it matters. So the question is, why can Argentina do it and Brazil can't? Well, it's probably more to do with belief and again, something to with what's been achieved or not. And again, we can talk a lot about other countries and their national debates. Obviously there's a debate going on in Uruguay about whether Garra Charrúa is still significant, or Colombia about do we have enough hierarchy of hierarchia to achieve things when it really matters? Can we somehow displace this and believe we can win and mix it with the big boys? Africa is somehow probably having the same questions in the different nations about what it takes for them to achieve. So I think all those types of debates are going. And I think what's important then we can then look at is how this identity then mixes into problems with football. So I think part of it is deconstructing and removing the whole process of starting again and removing all the building blocks that are kind of there. The idea of this isn't working, we're not succeeding, let's just tear it down and start again and basically ignore all the types of progress that we've made. And Dave's already made the point about how England are not far away from winning. It's probably more a case of enhancing what is already there in being a little bit more specific with certain things, or being a little bit more aware, or working on the mentalities to deal with pressure at those kind of moments. The burn it all down process isn't that beneficial. You've then got the idea of copying, of trying to impersonate and be something else, try and find a different identity. And then that might be tempted in a global world. Can we be more like Spain and play possession football? Can our players somehow become more like Argentina? And, there is something in the eyes that says you're never going to lose, and we'll mix it if we have to. Can you impersonate? Can you be something else? And again, that causes lots of problems. Again, in the Colombian perspective, for a long time, Colombia didn't really know what Colombia was in footballing terms, and just in terms of the kit. They copied a Brazil kit, they copied their own Millonarios kit, they copied the Dutch kit in the 1970s. It wasn't until the 1980s where the blueprint of what Colombia was achieved through wearing a yellow shirt, relying on Colombian coaches and looking at Colombian characteristics. And there are stereotype problems within that, but it seemed to work. And therefore, the Argentinian coaches and the Yugoslav coaches they'd gone to, in terms of trying to find a supplanted football, didn't really work. Now, again, Colombia have currently got, or the last two coaches have done very well, have both been Argentinians. So, are they impersonating again, or are they trying to find that extra characteristic of bronca, of aguante, that will take them that stage further? You've also then got this sense of improvisation, a lack of planning. Do we just improvise? What do we do? Is it spur of the moment? Well, that doesn't really work either, because you do have generations of ideas, of knowledge, of things that are proven to work. So more of an improvisational idea of, isn't necessarily going to work, particularly when we've got St. George's, when you've got structures in place, are we going to use those, or are we going to suddenly improvise and chuck it out in the bin? And then you've got belief and, what cultural memories are currently there that you can build on. and how do you build on those? And also, which ones are you selecting? There are so many memories that you can select as being crucial moments. England in lots of ways often focuses on some of those bad things, and they become embedded. Can you select and be more particular about choosing, for example, the Mexico win where Bellingham saves us and the rest of the players play very, very well, or where Kane, does what he does in the game against the Democratic Republic of Congo? How do you select those moments and make you believe? Again, one more point about this selectivity of memory. I was looking in Colombia thinking, well, the last time they were in the US, it's a dreadful tournament. Andres Escobar dies at the end of it. It's so much hope was lost. That World Cup was hardly mentioned that I could see in many narratives in the Colombian press. And that's probably a deliberate process to kind of select where you pick your identity moments, what you look on as being moments of strength and moments of weakness, and how you kind of construct a potent sense of identity that you can really believe in.
Hey Dave, in an ideal world, I think we'd have a World Cup where the teams weren't selected by geographical location, more mindset. That would make a team of artistic free thinkers, a team of dour pragmatists, a team of kind of like glass half full rather than glass half empty team, and a glass half empty rather than a glass half full team, Dave.
Well, it's a nice idea. I don't know who's going to be the managers and the selectors for this utopian World Cup that we're looking forward to. But I look forward to seeing it in 4 years' time. It'll be better than the 64 team version that we're currently hurtling towards.
Yeah, I'm sure that the free thinkers will lose the final 2-1 to the pragmatists, despite having opened the score in the first minute. British referee, Adidas Telstar ball. All played out at the Olympia Stadium in Munich. Gentlemen, it's been an absolutely outstanding way to spend an hour and 3/4. We did threaten 5 hours, but who knows, we might come back and do part 2 of this. Dave, have you enjoyed it?
It's been an absolute pleasure listening to Pete and talking rubbish from my end.
No, absolutely fantastic stuff, Pete. It's kind of like the political arm of the faculty is open. Part grumpy old man as well. I'd like to brand this as well.
Yeah, and it's always a pleasure and good fun to chat about these things. And I think what's really cool is that we're going beyond just a football discussion and talking about really interesting things about society, about memories, about culture, about identity, about what impacts on mentality and where those things come from. So it's really quite fun just to kind of explore these issues in a little bit more detail, to just go away from a tactical or blame kind of thing and look at some of the more granular issues. So yeah, good fun as always.
Excellent stuff. Yes, this is definitely the wizened round table version of the podcast. It's been an absolute joy. Actually, we're all sporting a bit of facial hair as well, which is very, very apt. We're off to put our scepters in the corner and to cook up some potions and consider a very druid-like set of events for the future. All that leaves me to do is to say thank you for listening. Please spread the word. Your boys took a hell of a beating. Shall ride again very soon. Thank you and goodbye.